In a peaceful suburban neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina, where every yard is perfectly trimmed and the houses look straight out of a magazine, no one expected anything like murder. But on a warm summer evening, that calm was shattered when the body of 19-year-old Tiffany White was found in her family's backyard. The discovery stunned the close-knit community, but what investigators uncovered next would be even more surprising. Beneath the well-kept lawns and friendly facades, a secret had been quietly brewing, one that tied Tiffany not to her friends, but to Lauren Hartman, a 43-year-old mother of two who lived next door. What started as a harmless friendship between a housewife and her teenage neighbor gradually grew into something far more sinister. Their hidden relationship, kept under wraps for months, descended into obsession, deceit, and eventually a tragic confrontation. But who really killed Tiffany White, and what was the motive? As investigators dug further into her life, they uncovered that almost everyone had something to hide. When the truth eventually came out, it was far more disturbing than anyone had expected. We're glad you could join us for this story. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and let us know where you're tuning in from. What's your home country? Lauren Hartman seemed to have the perfect life, one that many would envy. Lauren Hartman lived in a spacious suburban home in Charleston with her husband, Daniel, and their two teenage children. To outsiders, she appeared to be the picture of a successful, content housewife. Daniel, a successful lawyer, worked long hours and was frequently away, but his career allowed Lauren to focus on running the household. On the outside, everything about her life seemed flawless. Perfect husband, perfect home, perfect children. On the surface, Lauren had it all. But inside, she felt anything but perfect. At 43, the weight of the years was starting to take its toll on her. The vibrant, passionate woman Lauren used to be seemed to have disappeared, replaced by the routine of daily life. Her days revolved around school runs, grocery shopping, and the occasional book club gathering with other neighborhood housewives. Despite her attempts to stay engaged and keep busy, Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping away, out of her control, like sand through her fingers. Daniel, once her partner in everything, had become increasingly distant as his career took off. He was often away on business, and when he was home, their conversations were limited to the children or household matters. The closeness they once shared had slowly faded, leaving behind only a sense of duty and routine. Lauren was lonely, though she'd never admit it to anyone, not even herself. It was in this emptiness that she began to notice her neighbors, Greg and Susan White, and their daughter, Tiffany. The Whites had lived next door for years, but it wasn't until recently that Lauren began paying attention to Tiffany, the teenage girl who seemed to be coming and going from the house all the time. At 19, Tiffany seemed to have everything Lauren felt she had lost: youth, freedom, and a sense of vitality. The Whites were friendly but private, mostly keeping to themselves. Over the years, Lauren's interactions with them had been limited to the usual neighborly gestures: a wave in the driveway, a brief chat about the weather at neighborhood events. But everything shifted one afternoon when Tiffany came to the Hartman house to return a book she'd borrowed from Lauren during a neighborhood BBQ. Lauren had always thought of Tiffany as polite and well-spoken, but she had never given her much thought beyond that. However, when Tiffany stood on her doorstep that afternoon, something felt different. The girl's youthful energy was infectious, and as they chatted, Lauren found herself unexpectedly drawn to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. They started talking about Tiffany's plans for the future. She had just graduated high school and was taking a gap year to figure out her next steps before going to college. Without giving it much thought, Lauren invited Tiffany in for tea. It seemed like a simple, harmless gesture at the time. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and what was meant to be a quick visit turned into an hour-long chat. Tiffany spoke with a kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm that Lauren hadn't felt in years. She shared her plans, her dreams, and even her frustrations with her overbearing parents, opening up in a way that made Lauren feel more connected to her than ever. In return, Lauren found herself sharing things she hadn't told anyone in years. She opened up about her dissatisfaction with her life, the loneliness she felt, and how her marriage seemed to have lost its spark long ago. Tiffany listened intently, and Lauren was surprised by how easy it was to talk to her, as if the words had been waiting to come out. There was something about Tiffany that made Lauren feel young again, as though she were being seen, truly seen for the first time in years. Their connection grew quickly. What began as casual, friendly chat soon evolved into something more personal, more intimate. Tiffany started visiting Lauren more often, sometimes under the pretext of helping with household chores or running errands. But beneath their conversations, an unspoken tension began to build, a connection neither of them could deny. One evening, as they worked together in Lauren's backyard, the sun setting behind them, that tension finally reached its breaking point. They had been talking about Tiffany's frustrations with her parents, how they didn't understand her, how they were pressuring her to make decisions about her future when she wasn't ready. Lauren, feeling the weight of her own unspoken frustrations, reached out and gently touched Tiffany's hand in a gesture of comfort. It was a small, simple touch, but it sparked something between them, something neither of them could ignore. Tiffany didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at Lauren with an intensity that left her breathless. For a long moment, there was silence between them, the air charged with unspoken tension. Then, without thinking, Lauren leaned in and kissed her. At first, it was a tentative kiss, full of uncertainty, but as the seconds passed, it deepened, both women surrendering to the emotions they had been holding back. From that moment on, their connection shifted. It was no longer just emotional, it had crossed into something physical, something undeniable. The thrill of the forbidden affair was intoxicating for both of them. For Lauren, it was an escape from the monotony of her life, a way to feel desired and alive again. For Tiffany, it became an adventure, an act of rebellion against her controlling parents, and an exploration of her own desires. They started meeting in secret. When Daniel and the kids were out, Tiffany would come over to the Hartman house, and they'd spend hours together talking, laughing, and indulging in the passion that had begun to consume them. On other days, they would drive to quiet, secluded spots outside of town, far from the watchful eyes of their neighbors. As thrilling as the affair was, it also filled Lauren with a growing sense of dread. She knew what they were doing was risky, not just because of the age gap or the fact that Tiffany was her neighbor's daughter, but because of the potential consequences if they were caught. If Daniel ever found out, it would shatter her marriage and everything she had built. If the Whites ever found out, it would cause a scandal that could tear the entire neighborhood apart. But despite the risks, Lauren couldn't bring herself to end it. Tiffany had awakened something in her that she thought was gone for good, and the thought of returning to her old, empty life without her felt unbearable. As Lauren and Tiffany's affair deepened, so did the pressure on both of their lives. Lauren's once orderly, controlled existence began to unravel as she became increasingly consumed by the relationship. She found herself constantly thinking about Tiffany planning their next secret meeting, obsessing over the risk of being caught, and fretting about the consequences if anyone discovered the truth. At home, Lauren's behavior grew more erratic. She was distracted, anxious, and quick to snap at the smallest things. Though Daniel was often absorbed in his work, he began to notice the shift in his wife, the restless energy, the moments of tension that hadn't been there before. Lauren had always been calm and composed, but now she seemed on edge, unsettled all the time. Daniel chalked it up to stress, but even he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. At the same time, Tiffany's parents were starting to notice changes, two subtle shifts in their daughter's behavior that hinted something was off, though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Susan, who had always been close to Tiffany, began to notice subtle changes in her daughter's behavior. Tiffany, once a free spirit, was now spending more time away from home, acting more secretive than usual. She had become withdrawn, sneaking out late at night and avoiding her parents' questions. Concerned, Susan tried to have a conversation with Tiffany, but her daughter brushed her off, insisting that everything was fine, despite the obvious signs to the contrary. Despite Tiffany's assurances, Susan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was happening behind her back. She didn't know what it was, but the idea of her daughter keeping secrets from her felt deeply unsettling. Meanwhile, as the weeks passed, the strain of keeping the affair hidden began to take its toll on both Lauren and Tiffany. The constant fear of being discovered, coupled with their growing obsession, weighed heavily on them both. What had once been charged with excitement and passion now felt heavy with tension. Lauren was constantly on edge, terrified of being caught, while Tiffany, still infatuated, began to feel the pressure of maintaining their secret. The affair nearly came to a crashing halt one afternoon when Daniel unexpectedly returned home early from work. Daniel had finished his meetings earlier than expected and decided to surprise Lauren with a lunch date. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Tiffany's car parked outside. At first, he didn't think much of it. Perhaps she was just dropping something off, or maybe they were catching up. but a feeling of unease began to settle over him. Tiffany had often come over to help Lauren with various tasks, so Daniel didn't immediately suspect anything out of the ordinary. But when he walked into the house, an unsettling silence greeted him. The usual hum of daily life was absent, and as he moved toward the living room, he heard faint voices coming from upstairs. His stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. His curiosity piqued. Daniel quietly made his way up the stairs, his steps slow and deliberate. He paused just outside the bedroom door, listening. Through the crack, he could hear Lauren and Tiffany talking, their voices soft, but undeniably intimate. The tone of their conversation sent a chill through him, and his heart began to race. For a moment, Daniel considered knocking, confronting them directly, but something held him back. Instead, he stood frozen, listening intently, trying to make sense of what was happening behind that door. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone of their voices, the softness, the closeness was enough to send alarm bells ringing in his mind. Something was off, and he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Before Daniel could decide what to do, the door suddenly opened, and Lauren stepped out, clearly startled to find him standing there. She quickly composed herself, offering a weak smile and a hasty explanation that Tiffany was just helping with some household chores. Daniel didn't press the issue, but the unease in his gut only deepened, lingering long after the conversation ended. Something didn't add up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being lied to. After Tiffany left, Daniel turned to Lauren and asked if everything was okay. Lauren, weighed down by guilt, told him everything was fine, but Daniel wasn't convinced. Although Daniel had no solid proof, his instincts told him something wasn't right. He made up his mind to pay closer attention to Lauren in the coming weeks, hoping to uncover the truth behind the growing suspicions. Let's take a moment to pause and think about what's unfolding here. What are your thoughts on the situation we're exploring today? Feel free to share your insights in the comments below, and thanks for joining us. The tension between Lauren and Tiffany finally reached its breaking point during a neighborhood BBQ hosted by one of their mutual friends. Both the Hartman and White families attended, along with many of their neighbors, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. On the surface, it seemed like any typical suburban gathering: grilled burgers, cold drinks, and kids running around in the backyard. But underneath it all, the affair between Lauren and Tiffany was beginning to fall apart. Tiffany, who had become more emotionally invested in Lauren, was finding it harder to cope with the secrecy and lies surrounding their relationship. Tiffany wanted more from Lauren, but Lauren, feeling the weight of their secret, began pulling away. The constant fear of being discovered was overwhelming, and she knew that if she didn't end things soon, everything she had worked for: her marriage, her family, her reputation, would be destroyed. At the BBQ, Tiffany tried to talk to Lauren, searching for some reassurance that their relationship still mattered. But Lauren, nervous and tense, brushed Tiffany off, telling her they needed to be more careful and couldn't risk being seen talking too much in public. Hurt and frustrated, Tiffany could no longer hold back. She cornered Lauren near the side of the house, away from the other guests, and demanded to know what was really going on between them. The argument quickly escalated, with Tiffany accusing Lauren of trying to end their relationship, while Lauren insisted they couldn't keep sneaking around like this. Although they kept their voices low, their body language spoke volumes. A few neighbors, including Daniel and Susan, noticed the tension between them, though they couldn't hear the words being exchanged. It was clear something was wrong. After the BBQ, both Lauren and Tiffany knew their secret was hanging by a thread. They could sense the watchful eyes of their neighbors, and the risk of being exposed had never felt so real. While Lauren was ready to end the affair and try to salvage her old life, Tiffany wasn't ready to let go. She was determined to hold on to what they had, no matter the consequences. Just days after the argument at the BBQ, the unthinkable happened. On a warm summer evening, Tiffany's lifeless body was discovered in the backyard of her family's home. It was Susan who found her daughter, lying face down in the grass, her body bruised and cold. The shock of the discovery sent waves of horror through the neighborhood, and the questions surrounding her death would soon unravel everything. Susan was frozen in shock, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to explain the horrifying scene. Within minutes, the police arrived, and the peaceful suburban street was suddenly alive with flashing lights and the blare of sirens. Detective Mark Johnston, a seasoned investigator with the Charleston Police Department, quickly took charge of the case, his calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. From the moment Detective Johnston arrived at the scene, it was clear that Tiffany's death was no accident. The bruising around her neck and the signs of a violent struggle told a chilling story. This wasn't a tragic accident. Tiffany had been murdered. As investigators carefully examined the crime scene, they found evidence suggesting Tiffany had been attacked in the backyard, likely by someone she knew. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and nothing appeared to be missing. It became clear that whoever had killed Tiffany had done so in a fit of rage, making it even more personal and chilling. The news of Tiffany's murder spread quickly through the neighborhood, leaving the community in a state of disbelief. How could such a terrible thing happen in a place like this? Who would want to harm Tiffany, a bright, promising young woman with her whole future ahead of her? As the investigation began, Detective Johnston questioned everyone close to Tiffany: her parents, her friends, and her neighbors. But as the detectives dug deeper into her life, they uncovered secrets that no one had expected, turning the case in a darker direction. The first person Detective Johnston interviewed was Susan White, Tiffany's mother. Still reeling from the traumatic discovery of her daughter's body, Susan's grief was raw as she spoke. Through trembling words, she described Tiffany's recent behavior, how her daughter had been sneaking out more often and seemed increasingly distant, withdrawn even. Susan shared her concerns, but her pain was evident. She had no idea that anything so sinister was brewing beneath the surface. Susan admitted to Detective Johnston that she had suspected Tiffany was seeing someone in secret, but she could never figure out who it was. She had noticed the changes in her daughter, but like many parents, she dismissed them as typical teenage behavior. Greg White, Tiffany's father, was next to be questioned. He was clearly devastated by his daughter's death, his grief overwhelming his words. His answers were short, and he had little to offer in the way of useful information. He was just as lost and heartbroken as his wife. Greg told the detectives that Tiffany had always been a well-behaved girl, though recently she had become more rebellious, seeking greater independence. Like Susan, he had no idea who Tiffany might have been seeing in secret. After speaking with the Whites, the detectives shifted their focus to the neighbors, including the Hartman family. Lauren did her best to remain calm as she answered Detective Johnston's questions, but inside, she was overwhelmed with guilt and fear. She acknowledged that Tiffany had been coming over regularly to help with chores and errands, but she denied knowing anything about Tiffany's personal life or any secret relationships. Despite her assurances, the detectives weren't convinced. There was something about Lauren's demeanor that made Detective Johnston suspicious, an underlying tension that suggested she was holding back more than she was admitting. But without any solid evidence, there wasn't much he could do. As the investigation progressed, the detectives turned to Tiffany's phone records and social media accounts, hoping they might uncover some clues about who she had been secretly involved with. What they uncovered would completely shift the direction of the investigation. The detectives found a series of text messages between Tiffany and an unknown number, exchanged in the weeks before her death. The messages were deeply personal, revealing intimate details about Tiffany's life and her relationship with the mysterious person on the other side of the conversation. When the detectives traced the unknown number, they were stunned to discover that it belonged to Lauren Hartman. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The fact that Tiffany had been involved in a secret affair with her neighbor, who was married and more than twice her age, was both shocking and deeply unsettling. The discovery explained Tiffany's recent erratic behavior and the increasing tension between her and Lauren, which had not gone unnoticed by several neighbors. When confronted with the evidence, Lauren broke down, tearfully admitting to the affair. She confessed that she and Tiffany had been involved in a secret relationship for months, but she vehemently insisted that she had no part in Tiffany's death. Lauren claimed she had been at home with her family the night Tiffany was killed and hadn't seen her in days. However, her alibi was weak, and the detectives remained skeptical. They knew Lauren had been growing more paranoid as the affair risked being exposed, and there were multiple instances where she had lashed out at Tiffany in moments of jealousy and fear. The detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Lauren's emotions had driven her to something far more dangerous. The deeper the investigation went, the more it seemed that Lauren had both the motive and the opportunity to kill Tiffany. However, just as the detectives were on the verge of arresting her, a new piece of evidence surfaced that changed everything. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed DNA that didn't match Lauren's, throwing the entire case into doubt. The DNA matched her husband, Daniel Hartman. This discovery turned the investigation on its head. Until now, the police had been zeroed in on Lauren as the prime suspect, but with this new evidence, they had no choice but to consider the unsettling possibility that Daniel might have been involved in Tiffany's death. As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered troubling details about Daniel's behavior that suggested he had known about the affair long before it came to light. It turned out that in the weeks leading up to Tiffany's death, Daniel had grown increasingly suspicious of Lauren. He had noticed the tension between her and Tiffany at the BBQ, and on several occasions had followed his wife, hoping to catch her in the act of the secret relationship. The night Tiffany was killed, Daniel had confronted her in the backyard, demanding that she end the relationship with Lauren. The confrontation quickly escalated, and in a fit of rage, Daniel strangled Tiffany. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Daniel initially denied any involvement in Tiffany's death. As the detectives continued to press him, Daniel's defenses began to crumble. After hours of intense interrogation, he finally broke down and confessed to the murder. He admitted that he had followed Tiffany to her home that night, waiting for the right moment to confront her. When the opportunity arose, his anger had taken over, leading him to murder her in a fit of rage. When he saw her alone in the backyard, he approached her and demanded that she end the affair with Lauren. Tiffany, defiant and unafraid, refused. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, Daniel grabbed her by the throat and strangled her until she stopped breathing. In his confession, Daniel insisted that he hadn't intended to kill Tiffany, claiming it had been a crime of passion, driven by jealousy and betrayal. But the detectives weren't swayed by his excuses. Regardless of his emotions, he had taken an innocent life, and now he would have to answer for it. Daniel was arrested and charged with Tiffany's murder, bringing a shocking conclusion to a case that had already shattered the community. The fallout was felt deeply by both the White and Hartman families. Daniel's arrest and subsequent trial became a media spectacle, with the details of Lauren and Tiffany's affair plastered across headlines and dissected on every news channel. The scandal was impossible to ignore, and it left a permanent stain on both families' lives. The once peaceful suburban neighborhood was now the epicenter of a scandal that would haunt it for years to come. Susan and Greg White were left to mourn the senseless loss of their daughter, struggling to come to terms with the fact that her death had been the tragic result of a forbidden affair and a violent confrontation. Their grief was only intensified by the public nature of the trial, with the media relentlessly covering every detail of the case, leaving them no space to grieve privately. Lauren, though not criminally charged, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The affair with Tiffany had been exposed for all to see, and her marriage to Daniel was irreparably broken. She faced harsh judgment from her neighbors and former friends, ostracized and condemned by the community. Struggling with both the public humiliation and the weight of the tragedy, Lauren found it nearly impossible to envision a path forward as she grappled with the consequences of her actions. In the end, Tiffany's death served as a tragic reminder of how secrets, lies, and betrayal can spiral out of control, leaving devastating consequences for everyone involved. What began as a hidden affair between a housewife and a teenage girl ultimately ended in murder, shattering families and lives in its wake. Thank you for sticking with us until the end.